Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn webinar, Creating a Customer-Centric Company, brought to you by ArcherPoint and C5 Insight. The importance of being a customer-centric company seems obvious, yet many of us aren't. The principles to achieve exceptional customer experiences are not difficult or even groundbreaking. They are, however, evolving. The techniques and digital workplace tools that can make it a reality have advanced significantly in recent years. We are honored to have with us today Geoff Ables, author, speaker, entrepreneur, and international thought leader on customer and employee engagement. His insights have been seen and heard in dozens of global venues, including National Public Radio, Business Week, USA Today, Euroforum, the New Zealand Direct Marketing Journal, the Direct Marketing Association, Digital Summit, and in boardroom briefings across the country. He is the author of The Luck Principle, Business Results at the Intersection of People and Profit, and is a prolific blog writer on topics related to leadership, customer and employee relationships, and the future of work. He founded C5 Insight, a customer and employee engagement consulting firm, in 2002 and has consulted with hundreds of companies in a broad range of industries. In today's webinar, Geoff will share case studies of what a customer-centric organization looks like, how your data, processes, people, and culture have to align, and organizational disciplines that result in the best customer experiences. This webinar is designed to provide the tools and information you need to drive change, even transformation, in your company. So let's go ahead and get started. Geoff, over to you.
Thanks so much, Suzanne, and good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on what part of the globe you're joining us from today. So glad to get a few minutes of your time to talk about this topic of engaging our customers and becoming more customer-centric. So what I want to start by talking about is personal fitness. Now, before you check your Outlook calendar and make sure you're registered for the right event, here's what I mean. About a year ago, Christmas before last, my wife got me a Fitbit, and I got her message. She wanted me to get into better shape and to live longer, have more energy, and all of those great things. But I actually got pretty excited about it because I love gadgets. I want to get in better shape, and so I had this image of transformed me, a new me that looked better, that had more energy, that always felt a little bit better. All of those good things that we want for ourselves when we think about health and wellness and those kinds of things. And I wore that Fitbit for a couple of months, but then I fizzled out because I kind of got tired of the Fitbit telling me all the things I wasn't doing that I knew I should be doing. Rather than something that was changing my behavior, it became more of a nagging reminder of the things that I wasn't committing to, the things I was failing at regularly. And so I just kind of fizzled out from wearing it and decided not to use it anymore. But the interesting thing is I actually ended up getting some of the same results because my wife is also a personal fitness trainer, a health nut, and a bit of a drill sergeant. So I wound up over the course of that year starting to exercise a little more frequently, changing my routine even in terms of when I went to work, how often I got up and how far away I parked, those kinds of things, and changing some small things in the way that I ate and the things that I didn't eat as much anymore. And I wound up losing a fair amount of weight, having some of my energy going back up, and having a lot of those good things happen that I really wanted to have happen to begin with. And I'm actually starting to think about this year going back to the Fitbit to kind of take that to the next level. The idea there is, or what I learned is, it's not a Fitbit that transforms people. It's people embracing processes, changing the way they think and behave, and taking on a new level of discipline and even accountability that transforms. And the same is true in our business. A Fitbit can be great, but it needs to be integrated into how you're running your life. And the same is true with customer experience, customer relationship type of technology. Look, we all want this idea of transformation. We all kind of look at parts of our businesses and parts of our lives where we're the caterpillar and we want to emerge as the new, agile, nimble, beautiful butterfly. But we want a shortcut. We look for an easy button to go from one extreme to the other. And what we find when we try to make that jump with an easy button, rather than recognizing that change is incremental and can sometimes necessarily leave us a little bit vulnerable, we don't get the results that we're after. Look, in our digital world, the tools are increasingly important, and I am a big fan of the technology because it's an area that we consult in. But focusing on the Fitbit alone, focusing on technology to try to become more customer engaged, more customer-centric, it just doesn't give us the results we want. What you see on this page is probably an optimistic outcome. We've actually found that most organizations don't just fail at implementing CRM, they fail 3 or more times before they get it right. These statistics don't even take that into account. So the real failure rates are probably somewhere between 60 and 80% for any kind of customer experience projects. Our research is focused more on the CRM component of that. The reality is our society is changing. Business, ready or not, is going to change too. We are seeing more technology push into our relationships than ever before, probably more than since the beginning of the invention of the printed word. It really is changing the fabric of how we relate to one another. And like all technology advances, it has great potential for good or for bad. Right now, most of the concern about technology is, gosh, is this dehumanizing relationships? Is this removing the human touch? And there is some risk of that. Me, I'm an optimist. I think ultimately we find the way to turn this around to make it work for a good. And we've seen great examples of what I would call using technology to almost create a superhuman level of relationship, to allow people and businesses to scale the number of relationships and the depth of those relationships. So today we'll talk a little bit about technology. We'll talk a little bit about the Fitbit. But we're mostly going to talk about people and process because those are the pieces that organizations are getting wrong more often than not. Now, as we get into this, I have to tell you up front, these 5 habits we're about to talk through come from as a result of a lot of fairly humbling experience and research, and I'll come back to what that means later. But through that process over a number of years, we identified 5 habits that the successful companies use to transform into becoming more customer-centric. And we didn't invent these habits. They've always been there. We've just kind of been able to do the research and blessed to be in the right position to be able to learn some of those things. The real interesting thing about these 5 habits is they're the same things that the best individual, the best people-on-people connectors have practiced for thousands of years. They're really timeless types of principles, but companies that are doing the best have found a way to do these at scale. So a lot of it's common sense, but it's not common practice. So let's take a look at each and some practical tips for adopting them together. The best connectors in the world, the best individual connectors in the world, they always start with listening. And you know this is true. They don't start by talking about themselves. They start by listening to the person they're trying to establish a relationship with. And their listening skills go beyond just hearing or seeing printed words. They listen to body language. They listen to the context of the relationship, all those things that are said and not said in the relationship. And they and they have a great memory. They tend to remember those things, everything from names to places to facts and information that's been shared with them. So how do businesses emulate that? Well, it's pretty self-evident. Those businesses that do this well create a corporate memory. They create a place where everybody in the organization can participate and contribute to creating this collaborative corporate memory about the customers that they're dealing with. But there's a problem with that too, because most organizations in the rush to try to do a better job with this have created such a complex way and such a large number of places to listen that people are starting to feel enslaved, employees are starting to feel enslaved to technology. It's interesting, this thought on the slide actually came up through an interview with a client who was going through a customer experience transformation. And one of the folks, as they shared this, basically said, I feel like we've got this technology to put to work for me, but instead I feel like I've been put to work for technology. The statistics are real. The statistics tell us that when the average customer-facing employee goes from using 2 corporate systems to just 3 corporate database systems to get their job done, their job satisfaction drops by a little over 14%. But the average number of systems that the typical employee uses every week is as high as 25. Now, that's not quite apples to apples. 25 can include desktop systems and stuff like that. What we found a little more subjectively as we've talked to particularly customer-facing people in groups like customer service, inside sales, and marketing is that they usually use somewhere between 6 and 12 systems, corporate database systems, to get their job done. And the message they're getting through that from corporate is, look, technology is more important than you. Your job is largely to key and rekey and capture information and export and import things between multiple systems to get your job done. And that thing that makes us uniquely human, our ability to solve problems and relate to people, we don't have much time to do that because we're so busy feeding these pieces of technology that actually can be good at talking to one another if we'll only take the time to set them up to do that. So we're losing the key value of our people, we're losing the satisfaction of our people, and there's an absolute correlation between the satisfaction of our front lines, customer-facing people, and the level of satisfaction that our customers feel about doing business with our organization. So what can we do about that? What's the application? I'll go through this with each one of these, but what I mean by what's the application is not what's an app that we can install, but how do we apply this habit, this truth that the best are already applying? How do we listen better? So the first thing on this is this idea of riding along. And you don't need to overcomplicate this. So you've probably all heard of the iconic Harley-Davidson brand. What you may not know about Harley-Davidson is back in the late 60s, they almost went bankrupt. In fact, AMF, that's right, the bowling people, they came in and bought out Harley-Davidson and owned them through the 70s until the early 80s when Willie G. Davidson, the grandson of one of the founders, and a board of directors came and bought them back from AMF. Now, AMF kept the brand alive for those 10 years when they wouldn't have otherwise survived, but they didn't pay attention to a lot of things around the customer and around quality. So when Willie G and his board got together, the first thing they noticed was, we're sitting here talking about strategy and we're not really talking to our customers. We're a bunch of guys in a corporate headquarters disconnected from the customer. So they all got on an airplane. They flew to California and they rode with their customers all over the country, and they experienced some things in that context that they hadn't understood before. The first was quality. The bikes were going in for repairs way too often, and international competition was killing them there. So they improved the quality. But the next two things were the revelation. One was their customers were telling them, I want my Harley-Davidson to be as unique as my fingerprint. I want it to be something I can customize and tailor that makes a statement. I want that to be relatively easy to do. And I also want a community. I want people who understand that I'm also a Harley rider. Well, they invested in those things, and now Harley-Davidson is one of the most respected and beloved motorcycle brands, certainly in the U.S., and has a huge reputation internationally as well. Now, if you know a motorcycle rider, you know that there are really two kinds of motorcycle riders, people who ride Harley-Davidsons and people who ride everything else. And if you know about Harley-Davidsons, you know that you pay a premium for the brand, but you don't necessarily get a lot different of an experience in terms of quality of the vehicle with the brand. But if you know those Harley riders and you go into their garages, what you'll start to see is not just a Harley-Davidson that they paid for, but also a Harley-Davidson that they've probably invested thousands of dollars of additional money into customizing and tailoring to make it look, sound, and feel just the way that they want it to. And if you walk into their closets, you'll see hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in Harley-Davidson riding gear, T-shirts, casual things to wear in those closets. It's like no other brand experience you'll ever see. There's something different about how Harley-Davidson riders view themselves and view the world. And that started with riding along. Now look, you can't apply this necessarily to customer relationships at every level of your organization, but you should apply it to some. You can, however, apply it across your organization. When your IT department sits down with people who are facing the customer to try to decide what their technical needs are, They shouldn't just meet with them in small group meetings, listen to their requirements, and then start working on it. They should actually ride along with the people who are talking to the customers every day. Nothing will help them understand needs better than walking a mile in the shoes of the person that has to do the job. So you can apply ride-alongs at every level of your organization. Next, organizations need to start to listen in more places. So today there's more places to listen than ever before, right? Customers are talking to us through social channels, they're talking to us through electronic channels like email, they're talking to us face-to-face, so we need to be listening to them in our CRM systems, and even things like the Internet of Things, all these different devices that maybe are connected to our customers as well that we can listen to them through. But the interesting thing is most organizations still haven't gotten up to speed with the most fundamental area to listen to of all, and that is customer transactions. Nothing tells us more about what the customer is going to do in the future than how they've spent their money in the past. And yet most organizations do a terrible job of getting that information into the hands of the right people in the organization, those who face the customers every day, and those who look at large sets of aggregate information about customers so that they can make better decisions about those relationships. So organizations need to listen in more places to get a full picture of the customer, but at the same time, they need to figure out how to remember in fewer places. They need to make it not so difficult for their employees to capture that data and to find and reference that data when they need to make better decisions. And this last idea of how to apply listening is kind of an oddball, it feels like, but when you think about the best individual listeners, the best individual connectors in the world, they actually have a very well-developed sense of themselves. They don't just do a great job of connecting with other people, but they know who they are themselves. They know where they're going. They have a sense of their own purpose. The same thing is true of companies. It's very difficult to become a customer-centric company if you don't have a crystal clear sense of who you are and where you're going as a company. Now, the second area where the best listeners in the world excel, or the best connectors in the world excel, is this idea of going beyond listening and actually understanding. It's Stephen Covey who said, our problem is not that we don't listen, it's that we listen with the intent to reply rather than with the intent to truly understand. And the best connectors in the world get this. As they're working with other people, they're analyzing, they're empathizing, they're trying to understand the journey and the context. They're trying to understand what drives that other person so that they can connect to them ultimately in more relevant ways. And in the business world, we do that by analyzing our data. And we analyze it one story at a time, giving our people what they need when they're connecting with one individual customer, whether that's a service engagement or a sales type of engagement or whatever it is, and they analyze it thousands of stories at a time, giving analysts and executives the dashboards and granular data that they need to make better decisions. So how important is it that companies be able to do this? Well, according to the research on this page from IBM Research, it might be the critical differentiator between the companies that are succeeding and the companies that are doing average. What IBM did is they interviewed about 1,300 C-level executives, CEO executives, in global organizations, and they split them into two groups. Those who were in the top 20% of growth and profitability, and everyone else. And then they looked at the comparisons and contrasts between the two of them. The very top had a 108% gap between them and everyone else in their ability to access data, what we talked about in the listening principle, and drawing insights out of that data, the analytics piece that we're talking about now. And further, there was an 84% gap in their ability to then translate those insights into action. So the best of the best companies, not just in terms of how well they connect with their customers, but in terms of top and bottom line success, are very keenly focused on data, analytics, and turning those into action. But as with the other principle, there's a fly in the ointment. The idea is simple, the execution is a little more nuanced. Harvard Business Review recently found that the average worker spends 20% of their time looking for the stuff that they need to get their job done, looking for that email, looking for that document, looking for that order history, looking for whatever it is. And if you spend time analyzing this and thinking about it, you probably would either agree with that or think it's understated. That's what we hear from most of the clients that we interact with is, yeah, we do spend a lot of time looking for stuff. Well, let's quantify that a little bit. If you're a 1,000 person company and you pay the average employee $50,000 a year in salary, each of those employees are spending 2.5 months out of their year looking for stuff, and a lot of that looking probably means interrupting other employees, asking them where it is, and that equates to about $10 million in cost you're spending to do that. So why is that happening? Why are we having such a hard time getting our hands around this idea of big data? Well, underlying that problem is this. 53 to 80% of data on average is ROT. ROT is an acronym that stands for redundant. We've got multiple copies of it, and maybe we don't know which version is accurate. Outdated. When I do my search for information, I find stuff that's no longer correct, and I have to go search again to find the more recent version. Or trivial. When I go to find that one email I need, I've got to filter through 50 irrelevant emails to find that one specific one I need to solve the current problem. 53 to 80% of our data is ROT, and the statistics show this is becoming an increasing problem in organizations. So we as a corporate culture, we as people on this call, see big data as a big opportunity, but most of the new data we're creating is junk because data is cheap now and we've become data hoarders. Look, little data is where one-on-one customer-centric interactions take place. And little data is the building block for making better big data decisions. So the big problem we have to face is how do we do a better job of cleaning up our little data, and how do we do a better job of keeping it clean so that we can extract the full value out of big data. How do we apply this? Again, start simple. When you hear words like big data, it's easy to start to go to significant systems investments, and there's a time and place for doing that. But you can also start simple. So you've probably heard of Red Robin. They're a sort of a mid-range burger joint type of franchise. And to roll out a new menu or a new item on a menu, it can be over a year of R&D, developing the ingredients for the formula that goes into the menu, testing it out, getting it onto the printed menus, getting the restaurants up to speed with it, and so forth. They recently went through a round of that, but at the same time, they deployed an internal social engagement tool, something kind of like Facebook, but that's focused on employee connections, with the specified purpose of we want to create a tighter connection between the top of the shop, the executives, and the people who work in our restaurants day in and day out. We want them to have a clearer conversation and to drive better engagement. When they rolled out this menu and they started to have some of those executive front-to-frontline conversations, one of the things they heard was, hey, some of these new items on this menu, in fact one in particular, keeps getting sent back not finished. And it looks like it might be a problem. Executives re-engage. Hey, can you ask the customers why that is? So the employees did that. And what they learned was they said, it looks great on the menu, the picture looks great, the description sounds good, but it's not matching up with the expectations set there. We take a couple of bites and it just isn't appealing to us, so we send it back. In a matter of weeks, Red Robin was able to take something that, by the way, looked positive from a big data standpoint. It was a popular menu item right out of the gate, and found that there was a problem with it and was able to correct that problem in weeks instead of waiting the typical year while their brand equity gradually decayed as people had a negative experience. So something very simple, not a lot of technology involved, some very simple technology, but people and process and the technology had to come together to make it work. Then coming back and focusing on the core problem, organizations need to clean up their rot. Look, have you ever started a home project and found rot? I know that we did. We had we were going to repaint a front door, and we started taking a look at it and found that there had been some leakage in and around the front door over the years. And so the The frame of the house behind the front door was literally rotting away. So that project turned into something much bigger. We found all that rot. We had to essentially rip out the front door, spend a lot more time and effort cleaning out that rot than we wanted to. But once the rot was gone, we had a much better, more stable, long-term investment in our home. That's part of how we've got to examine rot within our organizations. Two levels. One is, yes, you need a spring cleaning. You need a new way to look at that front door and say, let's get the problem fixed, but you also need maintenance. Hey, how can we make sure that we don't gradually contribute to rot again by not changing old habits? Let's change habits and make sure that rot doesn't creep back in. So you need rules and processes for getting data clean and keeping data clean. I'd mentioned this earlier, but the biggest piece of data that organizations need to give everybody easy access to is historical information. The best predictor of the future is not what customers tell you. It's not what customers say that they intend to do. It's not what you collect as a salesperson when you're talking to a customer. It's not email click-through rates. It's not web traffic. None of those things predict the future as much as what has the customer spent with us in the past. Past buying behavior is always, always, always by far and away the best predictor of future buying behavior. And most organizations do a bad job of getting their hands around that and giving it to their people. And sometimes they lose focus because they're distracted by all the other exciting things. You've got to start by making sure you know your history with your customers. And again, another simple one to close this idea out with is this idea of validating what you hear. Don't just assume you've heard things right, but actually validate it. This can be used at all levels of your organization. We've seen statistical analyses come back that organizations look at, they look at the statistics, and they act on them, but those statistics were incorrect. They didn't make intuitive sense, and when you looked at them and analyzed them a little further, you realize the statistics were based on either rot, bad data, or faulty assumptions going into the front end of the analysis. So always validate and test everything before you roll it out with your customers. On the other hand, when you're engaging internally around becoming more customer-centric, you should also validate, test and validate ideas with how you engage with your customers, test and validate ideas with your internal teams. Again, it goes back to the Covey active listening habit of instead of just listening to someone and thinking you've got it right and taking action, actively listen and repeat back. So what I think I heard you say was this. You're just applying that principle at all sorts of levels, both individual but also at a highly scalable level when you're looking at thousands of records in aggregate. The third area where the best connectors really excel is connecting. And that makes sense, right? We've armed them with this information and this insight, so those folks are going to find relevant ways to connect. So connecting, yes, that's where the action is, but the action isn't done the way most people think the action is done. Look, the best connectors in the world look so natural. They look like they've never met a stranger. They drift into a room, they instantly make new, great friends relatively quickly, and they make it look like instinct, and maybe it is, but in the business world, the word for instinct is process. And businesses tend to err to one side of the process formula or the other when it comes with customer and relationship types of processes. On the one extreme, they say, look, process or relationships really aren't a process. It's really a personality trait. So we're going to hire highly relationship-oriented people, and we're going to turn them loose. Well, that's basically a bunch of Lone Rangers who are doing their own thing. You've got little chance to learn and excel when everyone's basically a cowboy. On the other hand, sometimes they look at it and say, hey, we're really good at processes. Maybe we're a manufacturer, an engineering firm, or something like that. And they say, let's take the rules we've used for developing processes and let's use those same rules to develop customer experience types of processes. And they straitjacket the process. They make it so rigid that there's no wiggle room for those core relationship skills to come out. There's no wiggle room for the human factor, the human touch. So how important is this? Look, there's a myth that sales and marketing don't need processes. The reality is that the most successful people in those roles absolutely have a process, and the most successful companies find a way to distribute those processes across the team. If your organization doesn't need institutionalized, customer-oriented processes to be successful, then you're really just a bunch of independent contractors under one roof. You know that's not true. You know you want to learn best practices from each other and continuously improve. Process is how you do that. So how do you get started with that? One of the first things we found is you need this idea of someone steering the customer experience. Creating a better customer experience is not something you just say, hey, that's everybody's job. Let's all try to do that as our individual departments. Instead, you need some kind of multidisciplinary steering committee with a clear leadership structure in it to help drive that forward. So start steering, put that committee together. Our research tells us that there's about a 30% improvement in success rates for customer experience projects when you have a multidisciplinary steering committee with clear leadership structure in place. But what our subjective research says, I can't give you quantification on this, is when those steering committees fall apart, when people wave the victory flag and go back to business as usual, exactly that happens. The business returns to its normal state, those habits have not been institutionalized yet, and the project tends to fall apart. So you need to begin by saying, we need to bring a team together, a team of leaders who have power and visionary expectations around this project together with a clear leadership structure, and we need to plan to keep that together for a while. There may be some changes in that team, but we need to keep the idea of that team together for the long term. Secondly, balance your wheels. So what does that mean? Going back to what I said earlier about the two ways organizations tend to fail with customer processes are unique from other business processes in that they balance rigidity, they're rigid at the core, and flexibility. They're flexible around the edges like a wheel. Here's an easy way to remember that. They need to be rigid enough at the core to have rims. They have to be repeatable, improvable, measurable, and scalable. That's rims. So in other words, that's a whole idea of processes, that if we have processes, we can do them again and again, so we can find what's working and we can make it happen again and again, but we can also monitor them and improve them, and we can scale them across a large group of people. It's not just a matter of, well, we have to hire another person that has those innate abilities. If we hire another person, we can also automatically give them these tools to help them be more successful. But they have to remain flexible enough around the edges to empower people to react and respond to individual, unique situations and to build their unique personality into the situation. And the last idea for connecting is this idea of building a process GPS. So what I mean by that is the organizations for many years have become good at developing the more rigid types of conventional business processes. You don't build customer processes just once and you're done. Just like any other process, you're constantly evolving new ones. There's probably dozens, if not hundreds, that need to be built in your organization. Processes around sales, around many different attributes of marketing, around how you deliver customer service, and all sorts of other things in between. So you need not just a process, but a process, a way to say, how do we develop and evolve these processes a little bit more consistently so we have a repeatable pattern we can use to roll out new customer processes. I'll revisit this idea again at the end of the session. And the fourth way that the best connectors in the world connect is they never stop improving. They're focused on continuous improvement. They want to know the results. They want to always fine-tune. They don't just develop great people skills and then coast on those for 30 years. Though some may do that, the best continue to be sensitized to what's going on in the world around them, what's going on in their relationships, and how do I constantly improve those. And when you're in a business, the counterpart of that is businesses need to know the score, they need to share the score, and they need to give employees a voice in changing the score, having input into the score. That's when employees engage, and that's when you get the very best ideas. Now, few companies struggle to understand the big scoreboard. Most of them know that because you don't survive long if you don't know your huge objectives. Stay profitable, grow revenues, those kinds of things. But most companies really struggle to know the score at the individual level. In fact, managers have reported, 73% of managers have reported that they don't have the metrics they need to measure the contribution of the individuals on their team. So that sounds like bad news, and it is, but that's actually the better news. The worst news is, how do you share the score? You have to know it to share it, and companies are really struggling with that. Once you do know the score, how good are we at sharing it and working together to improve it? Well, research by the Center for Creative Leadership tells us that 86% of leaders say collaboration in our organization is absolutely critical to driving results. But only 7% of the leaders in those same organizations believe they're doing a good job of that. A whopping 79% gap in our ability to work together better as organizations. So there's a lot of room for improvement around how we continuously improve what we're doing as businesses when it relates to our customers. So what are some simple practices that we can adopt? Most of you probably know what a BHAG is. It's called a Big, Hairy, Audacious Goal. It's been widely publicized. But big, hairy, audacious goals are good to have. Everyone needs them. Some people just call them a wildly important goal or something like that, but basically it's your big annual top line, bottom line types of goals that you're trying to get everyone to rally around to drive a little bit. The problem with BHAGs is it takes a long time to get there. Sometimes they change in the process, and you don't always succeed in actually attaining those goals. And it doesn't take long for the human factor to weigh in there and people to lose motivation around BHAGs that take too long to arrive at, are too ambiguous, or that they don't really understand what their impact is on. Enter the idea of SQUAGs. A SQUAG is a short, quickly attainable goal. Again, you can call these a lot of things. They go by the name KPI, Key Performance Indicator, in a lot of businesses. The difference between a SQUAG and a BHAG is a SQUAG can be accomplished quickly, it can be measured weekly, it's a leading indicator, not a trailing indicator. A trailing indicator, like a BHAG, is you don't know if you've gotten success until it's too late to really change it, right? We want to change profitability. Well, I don't know if I've done all the right things to change profitability until the profitability figures come in, and by then it's too late for me to have any impact on it anymore. SQUAGs are things that individuals can absolutely have control over, and they indicate what the BHAG is going to be. In other words, you believe if you impact that SQUAG, you will impact the BHAG. So some examples of SQUAGs. Something might be something like how many calls a salesperson is going to make per day, how many issues a customer service rep is going to solve in a given day, how many emails will go out. All those kinds of things that you can basically have 100% control over. It might require a little more effort or a change in priorities, but you can absolutely have an impact on those. It can even be safety things like, are our people wearing their safety goggles all the time so that we can reduce on-the-job hazards. That's not necessarily customer related, but the idea is the same there. It might be something else you can relate to. So giving people these more short, quickly attainable goals that they can absolutely impact, and then reviewing those regularly is absolutely critical. And part of reviewing those regularly means celebrating. So many businesses are anticlimactic in what they're doing. They're in the routine of day-to-day doing things again and again, and although small goals may be attained, they're rarely celebrated. So taking the time to stop and celebrate, set those short, quickly attainable goals, and then review them. And you might need to push back and say, we didn't make it, but now we can adjust our behavior to make it. Or when you make it, having a celebration. It does not need to be a big, expensive thing. It can be something very small, but that keeps people more engaged in the process. The third thing is the companies that do best get their dashboards right. It seems like everybody has dashboards these days, but they're either the wrong dashboards, they're too big of a dashboard, or they're an irrelevant dashboard. I'm not big into sports analogies, but one fits really well right here. The idea of a dashboard in sports works well in football. Look, in football, a coach has, there's first of all the big dashboard, the scoreboard that everybody can see. And a coach has an unbelievable number of statistics that they look at as they decide on what plays to call in and who to put on the field and those kinds of things. But each one of those individual players, they just have a few small SQUAGs, a few small key performance indicators, metrics that they know they can directly impact and influence for the team. So how many yards on the ground, how many passing yards, how many sacks did I get, whatever those things are, but some very clear things that they can look at and say, look, when it comes down to the ground, the game on the ground, I know what my role is, I know what metrics I'm trying to hit. But a lot of organizations roll out massive dashboards that distract everybody, or not the right dashboards to really drive individual behavior. Now, it's okay to share the dashboards with everyone. It's okay to be an open organization, but there's a time and place to give people their specific metrics that they're trying to meet, and a time and place to review the corporate metrics together as a team. And the last thing to think about with knowing the results is this idea of becoming a fail-safe organization, being fail-safe people, creating a fail-safe organization. The picture in the background here is a B-117 bomber. You may not know much about those, but they're 103 feet long and about 23 tons of steel, and were absolutely critical to the Allies' strategy for success in World War II. But the Allies had a major problem with their bombers. More of them were getting lost over enemy territory than was acceptable. Not just acceptable, but sustainable. The potential for failure, of course, was catastrophic if they couldn't turn the situation around. So they put some of their best military analysts on it. They took a look at the planes that came back and they said, look, we can't reinforce the entire hull of these airplanes. It will be too heavy for them to take off. But we can selectively reinforce. So let's look at where the bullet holes are showing up most frequently. Let's reinforce those. They did that. Off the airplanes went. Same number of airplanes get shot down. They're in a dire situation. How are they going to turn this around? The outcome of the war is at stake. Well, along comes a Hungarian refugee, a Jewish guy by the name of Abraham Wald. And Wald took a look at the research in the airplanes and said, you're measuring the wrong thing. You're measuring success. You're not comparing success to failure. And that's where you're going to have your learnings. What's the difference between the planes that are getting shot down and the planes that are coming back? Well, through a series of things, they were able to do that research. They changed where they did the reinforcement. Off went the planes, and you know how the story ended. More of them came back. The lesson learned there is we learn more from our failures than we do from our successes. But in our business culture today, it feels so much better and so much safer to talk about our successes than to talk about our failures. But when we get together to talk about those squags and we're deciding if we're going to celebrate or not, part of the conversation has to be, where are we missing that? How are we going to improve? Where are the holes in the armor of the ideas that got shot down, that never made it back? And how can we work together as a team to improve those things? It can't be a shooting the messenger culture. People will close in. It can't be an ivory tower culture. People can't truly get the best ideas unless the entire team is engaged in that process. So the question to ask yourself is, are you a fail-safe person, and are you in a fail-safe culture, and how can you contribute to creating a culture that's more and more fail-safe? So listen, understand, connect, and know. Those are the first 4 of our 5 principles. I like to make things really simple, and so if you think about the first letter of each of those, you have your acronym, the LUCK principle. And look, it's really simple. It's kind of common sense, really, but it's clearly not easy because so many companies are failing so badly at that. The reality is, look, forgetting company and customer centricity, just think about human relationships. One-on-one relationships aren't easy. Ask any family. But the rules that have worked for one-on-one relationships for hundreds and thousands of years work for many-to-many relationships as well. Now, many-to-many will be more difficult than one-to-one, but using good processes and good technology, you can take digital tools and you can scale those great principles to work for much larger organizations. And the proof is out there. Organizations are succeeding with doing that. The happy story for us is this applied to a lot of different things. But let me go back to our original story I started to tell you about how we developed LUCK, because it was a humbling process. We started life as purely a CRM type of consulting company, and one of the things we saw as we got into it were some failure statistics, and we do whole sessions around failure statistics and how to improve and all that kind of stuff. As we looked at those statistics, we were pretty prideful because we said, look, almost all of our clients are happy at the end of our projects. We tend to finish on time. If things change, we communicate that well. We tend to finish within budget, and our clients tend to like us and give us good reviews when we're done. But then we started looking in the rearview mirror 1, 2, 3 years into the future, and it started to look a lot like that Fitbit did. We started to say, you know, these things are not always finishing well. They're fizzling out a lot of times. Even though a lot of the things we thought were the right things to do were in place, they ultimately weren't. So that led us on this humbling journey where we got taught a lot by a lot of our clients, and we did a lot of our own research, and we found this idea of the luck principle. Now, the happy ending to that particular story is when we came back and brought all of that together, we started to realize this relates to the brokenness of relationships in and out, but particularly in business, no matter where that happens. So luck can be applied to better employee engagement. It can be applied to CRM as a tool, but also to the customer experience as an overall process and thought. It can even be applied to things like meetings and project management to make those work better. Let's face it, meetings these days are generally a miserable experience for most organizations. But if you take this principle and say, how can we change our meetings to embrace these 4 principles, you start to get more effective, engaging meetings for people. So as we looked at all that, we were excited, and we started to see this is the process GPS. Remember when I talked about you need a process for developing your processes? That's your framework. Luck is your framework for saying, hey, when we think about sales process, when we think about customer buying experience, when we think about customer service, let's hold it up to these 4 habits and say, how are we doing these things better and better throughout this process? So it can become a framework you can use. But even with all that, we were still a little frustrated because we found, yes, we got some good traction with it. Some of our clients were being very, very successful, but some were really struggling. Even some that seemed to embrace it and really try to apply it, they just seem to struggle and fizzle out a little bit more often than the others. And like happened with most of the other things we've learned, we learned some more things from a great client. It happened one day when we were in their boardroom and we were on a break from a meeting we were having, and they filtered out and our crew stayed in the room, and we started looking at their mission statement. A lot of companies have them on their wall, and this company was no exception. Now, these folks were doing great with this idea of the luck principle. They'd embraced it. They had a tremendous amount of momentum and were doing very well. And when we looked at the wall on that mission statement, we started to comment to each other how people-centric that mission statement looked. And there were a few things about finances and those kinds of things, but in essence, they were saying our mission, and they were a for-profit company, but our mission is to serve people. Ultimately, we exist to serve people, and they had a lot more specifics, but that was it. And we started to talk about that and wonder out loud if that was the missing ingredient. And we called this idea of the missing ingredient good luck. And it has to do with things like how you manage change, what your culture looks like, what's your sense of purpose as a business, how do you put people into that, and how do you balance all of those things? Look, the best connectors in the world, they all have a people-centric sense of purpose. So I'm a numbers guy. I was probably the last one in our group to get comfortable with this because that didn't sound like a thing I could quantify very well. So some smart people did some more research and we started to quantify it, which made me feel a little bit better. But it's still an idea that's hard to get your hands around. So let me try to explain it in a couple of different ways. Luck is what you do. Luck is a process, it's steps, it's habits that you develop. Good luck is who you are. Let me put it a different way. I have a really good friend, incredibly successful guy. He's a little bit older than me, but he retired in his mid-30s about 20 years ago. So very bright guy, tons of business savvy, and after he retired, he's actually decided to spend the rest of his life giving back to social needs. He's gotten very deeply involved with nonprofit organizations and has done a tremendous amount of good in the world. But what I can also tell you about this guy is he is one of the coldest, most calculating people I've ever met. Now that sounds horrible, but I mean cold and calculating in the best possible terms. He's just a very calculating kind of guy. He decides what he wants to do. Every time you're around him, there's this sort of sense of purpose that can feel kind of like manipulation, but again, coming back to it's all towards a good ends. It's not towards a selfish ends, it's towards an ends to make things better. So it's forgivable, but he's still a cold person. He knows it, his friends joke with him about it, and his wife knows it. And so it bothers him. Not too much because he's kind of cold, but it bothers him. So he decided, you know, I don't want to have this reputation as a cold person. So he did what he does. He did some research on it, and he found something that said, you know, people who have a pet, a dog in particular, tend to be thought of as warmer people than people that don't have a pet. So, okay, he went out and bought himself a dog. Now what I can tell you about that dog, and the dog isn't around anymore, the story went back a number of years, but whenever I'd go over to his house, That poor dog was the most attention-starved animal that I've met in my entire life. Now, it wasn't because my friend decided to do that to the dog, but the reality was it wasn't who he was. He took the action, he practiced luck, he took the step, but it didn't really change who he was. A warm person gets a dog. A dog doesn't make a person warm. So how do we get there? Well, look, in businesses, the best organizations never, ever, ever, ever forget they exist to serve a customer, not to make a profit. Now, pause right there. I know that's hard to hear for some folks. Look, if someone asks you as an individual how you're doing, do you stop and take your pulse and say, 70 beats per minute, I guess I'm doing pretty good? Of course not, especially if it's somebody that you know. You search your history and your recent experiences, and maybe you talk about something great that happened in your family or an accomplishment you've had. Maybe you talk about some pain you've gone through or something like that. That's the definition of how are you feeling. Companies exist to serve people, but they make a profit as a side, which is an important thing for them to do. It's really important for you to have a pulse. Without it, nothing else matters, but it's not the reason you exist. So how do we start to do that in our organizations? I'm just going to close this section with one idea. There are a lot of things you can do here, but this is one that we get wrong again and again as organizations, and it's absolutely critical to changing how people think about engaging with customers. And it's simple. It's defining what is the why at a lot of levels. Look, when you think about, I want to become a more customer-centered organization, how do I do that? Most organizations think, well, we'll define better processes, we'll implement technology, and we'll train people on how to use the technology. In her 9th annual global survey on the digital age, Jane McConnell looked at just that. She said, what are the things that are driving change in our new digital economy? She came up with the 5 top change drivers. I can tell you, not on the list are technology, process, or training. None of those made the top 5. What did make the #1 slot is a sense of why. Look, have you ever noticed if you ask somebody to do something, if you just tell them what you want, here's what I want, here's how to do it, oftentimes you're disappointed with the results. But if you can really engage with somebody and express to them not just what you want, but why, what's the vision, where are you going, and they are engaged in that conversation, you'll actually get something oftentimes that exceeds your expectations. But as businesses, we get hung up on maybe a little bit of why and a lot of here's exactly how to do your job now. And people lose sight of the why. If they really get the why, if they really understand it and buy into it, they're going to figure out the how. But if all that they're told is the how, they're never going to get there on their own. They're never going to give you their all, because that's what employees want to engage. They want a sense of purpose. They want a sense of connection to this bigger vision of where the organization's going. And that's not just a big picture why. It's not just why do we want to be more customer-centric. It gets all the way down to why do I want you to take an extra 10 seconds every time you record a transaction, every time you save a document. Why is that important? What's the ultimate benefit? How is that going to make us better? Explaining the why at all those levels starts to get the buy-in that you need. Now, there are 4 more things on Jane McConnell's research, and I'm not going to tell you what those are, because this is the one that you've got to get right first. So that's the luck principle, and here's a quick summary of what that is. If you want to do a screen capture, you can. I'll give you a couple other places where you can learn more. We've certainly got some of this on our website as well, but that's the highlights. Again, simple to understand, very intuitive, very, very difficult to follow, very difficult to master these things. So understanding all these in context is really important. And as we close, I want to just share a couple of other thoughts. I love a good quote. I'm a sucker for a really pithy quote, and here's a really smart guy who said a lot of really great things and left us with some great quotes. Look, for 50 years, technology has been a huge blessing to our business culture, but it's also been a curse. It's resulted in a lot of disconnection from our customers and from each other that we didn't used to have in the past. When you had the old corner store where the owner knew everybody, that's what we ultimately want to get back to as businesses too. We want our customers to feel known, understood, and engaged with, and we want our employees to feel that way too. But technology has created this problem. And applying technology to this problem in the same way we've applied it to all of the other problems that technology has done such a terrific job of solving is not going to solve this problem. So my question to you is, what small step will you take? How will you change your thinking? How will you build some of this process into your organization to become a more customer-centric person and lead your company in becoming a more customer-centric organization? If you want to dive deeper, here's several different options. We have a lot of webinars. You guys know Archer Point, I think. We partner with them on some of these as well. The book that was mentioned at the beginning of this is now available on Amazon. You can follow that link to get to it on Amazon.com. And we also do workshops. We actually have one on building a better intranet and one on CRM coming up. 2-day workshops. They are non-technical. They are focused on bigger picture things like how do we plan, how do we have a strategy, how do we change behavior, how do we put governance rules in place, how do we clean up rot. That's what these are focused on. There's plenty of technical training things out there. Our workshops tend to be focused on how do we make this happen from a planning and leadership standpoint. So I hope you'll take advantage of some of those resources to dive a little bit more with this idea of becoming a more customer-centric organization. And I know we're about to open it up to questions, but before we do that, I wanted to also thank everybody for your time today. Really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. You can tell I have a lot of passion on this topic. And as a speaker, what I can tell you is nothing is more pleasing to me than engaging with you guys, hearing your questions, getting an email saying, here's one thing I got out of this that really helped me, or just sharing your story. I love to hear those. It always helps us to grow as an organization. So thank you so much, and I hope that you'll reach out and connect either now or after the session. Suzanne, back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Geoff. A lot of great things to think about there and try to implement. So I do have a couple questions here. Can you explain how to apply luck directly to sales and marketing processes?
Great question. Sure, it's probably not just a couple minute answer, but in general, sure. Let me give you one classical example. So when we do process design, in fact, with Suzanne and Archer Point, we'll be doing another webinar on this in a couple of weeks. We look at a standard sales process, and what we do is we hold luck up next to it. Think of a matrix. So think of, here's all the steps in the customer buying experience, or here's all the steps in our sales process. And then as a matrix, we'll put luck down the side and say, okay, so how are we listening? How are we getting better data by listening to the customers throughout this process? How are we understanding? What decisions are we making? What analysis do we need to do? How are we connecting with them? What are the tools and pieces of marketing literature and those kinds of things that the customer is expecting to make their buying decision easier at this stage? And how do we know what the results are? What are the KPIs we're going to track to find out, did we do this well or not? So that's very high level, but if you think of any kind of customer-focused process, whether it be an email marketing process or a direct face-to-face sales process, if you turn that into a matrix and say, here's the steps across the top, here's luck down the side, and now at the intersection of each of those, how are we doing a better job by applying the luck principle? Good question, and I know that was a broad answer, but hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, so I know that we are almost out of time here, and don't see any more questions in our chat pane. So with that, I'd like to wrap it up. If you did enjoy today's session with Geoff, please do join us on our next webinar with C5 Insight. It's called the Rapid Sales Design Process. It's going to be on March 21st, and you can also check out our other exciting upcoming webinars on our Archer Point events page. I will share both links with you in the follow-up email that will also include a link to today's recording. As always, we welcome your comments and feedback. Please send them to info@archerpoint.com. Again, info@archerpoint.com. Thanks so much, Geoff. Thank you, everyone, for your time. And this concludes today's session. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.